really fast.
We won't be voting or anything today.
No, I know, but I have,
Those are not usually page turners.
yeah.
It's like.
All right, everybody, welcome back.
Session meetings. You must.
We are picking up our work here on S17, and Mr. Devlin is going to walk us through a strike-all amendment to the bill that I've been working on. Representative Byron has been involved in some conversations. I had asked for feedback on a couple of initial sets of language, some of which came from the department. Got some feedback from Vermont Sheriff's Association and other stakeholders, and tried to find a path that would invest in a position at the department that would help with training, professionalization, development of model policy. So you'll hear a new deputy director at the department referred to here, and step back from the Senate as passed proposal around changes to the 5%. There were a couple issues there that I think you'll see addressed here. I added a finding section in lieu of and struck the section that was in the Senate as passed language that would have created a couple of, I think, kind of catch-all category B conduct violations that I think were already kind of baked into category B from the testimony that we had heard. So I wasn't sure really what was new there. And I think the enumerated category B conducts, it seems like a lot of the folks we heard from preferred the specificity. So I put in some findings here and thought that that would help maybe people understand a little bit of why we're doing these things as opposed to other things that I've heard people ask us to do, like come up with a path to suspension or something like that. So I could talk a lot more about this and will, but I think the prudent thing to do here would be to have Tim walk us through what's on the page and maybe focus on sort of the differences between this and S17 as it came over to us. So thanks very much, Tim, for all your work on this.
You're very welcome, and thank you very much, Chair McCarthy. For the record, my name is Tim Devlin, Legislative Counsel. Before you, you have draft 1.3 of a strike-all amendment from the committee to S17. And just for reference, any of the changes between the Senate bill and this bill have been highlighted to easily identify them. That doesn't mean everything in here is new language necessarily. Sometimes it restores it. It's really single 17 in this amendment. If there's any questions as to what's new or old language, just feel free and I can stop and point it out. The first part of the bill is now, let's see, we have a new reader assistant heading titled Findings, and section 1 is also titled Findings. This is session law that lays out the intent of the bill. Really, sorry, I should say the findings. But quickly, I'll just note and reiterate what Chair McCarthy just said, that this replaces prior section, the Senate's bill, which was titled Unprofessional Conduct of Law Enforcement Officers Reviewable by the Vermont Criminal Justice Council. In particular, the old language would have added 2 items to category B conduct for LEOs or law enforcement officers. One would have been H, gross negligence or willful misconduct in the performance of duties. And the second one would have been subdivision I, abuse of powers granted through law enforcement officer certification pursuant to section 2358 of this title. Returning now back to the new language, here we have section 1 findings and
Representative Hingham.
Thank you. So in terms of that category B behavior, I'm looking at number 2 under the findings. I wonder if we should not enumerate, what these practices or behaviors are, and just say incidences of criminal and unprofessional behavior by elected sheriffs and sheriff's deputies have shaken the public's trust in the office of sheriff, because this almost limits us to those things, in my opinion, but there could be more. I mean, for instance, what if we did something else?
I'd be fine with accepting edits to some of the findings. And just to be clear, the findings they're kind of designed to provide anyone who's reading the bill and our colleagues with a sense of sort of how we arrived at these policies. I'm not married to that language. I think that might be a great suggestion. Representative Boyd.
Going off of that, rather than laying out some of the categories under category B, can we just say category B, conduct? Under whatever the VSA.
See, I think here in the findings, I would prefer that we kind of stay more like up in any reasonable person could understand what this was, as opposed to somebody who knew a lot of stuff about the law. But yeah, these are all great things. What I'd like to try to do is see what's on here first, and then we'll go back through again and maybe write down some suggestions. So I think before we get too far in the weeds of trying to wordsmith this draft, if it's okay with everybody, get Tim through a pass through, and then we'll go back and do some notes and have some committee suggestions for an update. This is definitely sort of a new clean start to conversations about what should be in the bill. So appreciate the initial feedback. I want to make sure we give Tim a chance to get through it at least once.
Chair McCarthy, would you like me to do a line by line of the newly added or highlighted text as we go through it, or just summarize and continue?
I think a good level of detail. We've got a little bit of time, so if you want to do a line by line on the new stuff, I think that's probably good, just so everybody can kind of read it through carefully together at the first pass.
Absolutely. So on line 8, the updated section 1, we'll now read titled Findings. Again, this is session law. Read, the General Assembly finds that 1, sheriffs provide essential public safety services to the state, counties, and communities of Vermont. 2, incidents of criminal and unprofessional behavior by elected sheriffs and sheriff's deputies, including excessive use of force, embezzlement, assault, and questionable financial practices, have shaken the public's trust in the office of sheriff. 3, the office of sheriff requires reform to provide more consistent structure, financial practices, accountability, and increased transparency. 4, while criminal charges or misconduct may lead to sanctions on Vermont sheriffs, including decertification by the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, removal from office can only be achieved through expiration of term, resignation, or impeachment by the General Assembly. The next part of the bill, it regards audits. And section 2 has been updated, specifically the amendment to Title 24 VSA, section 290, titled County Sheriff's Department, subsection D. And just briefly, this rewrites the section so that 1, when a sheriff signals intent to leave office, they will provide a written transition plan. And 2, the county's assistant judges will consult with the Department of Sheriffs, with the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs and the Sheriff's Executive Committee when it comes to the transfer of any assets during that transitional period. The new language, as modified, will read subsection D. Upon the election of a sheriff-elect who is not the incumbent sheriff, an announcement that the incumbent sheriff will not seek a re-election, or an announcement that the incumbent sheriff intends to resign, whichever occurs earliest, the outgoing sheriff shall provide a written transition plan detailing all financial disbursement from the accounts of the department, including the transfer of real or personal property or other assets of the department to the county's assistant judges who, in consultation with the Department of Sheriff's Executive Committee, shall provide written approval prior to any sale or transfer of the items identified in the plan. A copy of the approved plan shall be filed with the auditor of accounts and the assistant judges within 15 days after completing the outgoing sheriff's deputies after the sheriff leaves office. And
Just a quick question about the word audit. I think we heard that in one of the testimonies that it doesn't necessarily, or shouldn't necessarily have to be a full audit every time. Do we need to specify that? Because there is an associated cost with a full audit versus a partial audit.
So I believe, and we should follow up on this, that in this section, we're talking about the already required audits that happen, but what we're really doing is expanding, not so much in this piece, what we're doing is basically saying that the existing audit structure is going to cover and have this additional period or sort of additional trigger of having the announcement that somebody's going to retire, then go to, okay, we need to have a plan, and there's going to be on any, major financial transactions, this sign off from the county officials, the side judges. So we should take a little bit more testimony. This was language that came from the department, actually, and then had a further modification in the initial draft we were talking about yesterday. So Rory, touched on this yesterday, and I think we want to hear from them a little bit about those mechanics. I do remember Representative Mrowicki in the comments yesterday talking about maybe we need to specify which level of audit. That was a suggestion from yesterday that didn't make it in here. So it's something I think should flag as a note that we want to continue to think about. I was hesitant to try to go down that rabbit hole with Tim last night when I was trying to do a lot of other things, but I think it's a valid suggestion. My understanding, Tim, is that the section that you just read, that alone isn't going to trigger a new set of audits.
No, I don't believe it would.
Okay.
I think you'll recall that in the testimony we've heard a few times that right now there's the requirement that there be an audit every other year of the sheriff's offices. And then when there's a transition.
This
Right.
is specific to the transition.
Okay,
Yeah.
it says it transition, okay, then
So when
that
it's
answers
known
my
that someone
question.
announces that they're not running again, et cetera, this is specific to that transition period.
Okay. Yep, that, as long as that transition is in the original intent.
Yeah, so the existing current practice is that audit happens. Now, the auditor did ask us, and I haven't addressed it in this draft, did ask us to look at the idea of if there's an audit with that, if we just did the biennial audit and then there's going to be a transition or resignation, do we really need to do another full audit? I think that specifically is a really good area where we could probably get all the transparency we want out of this without having to do a complete second audit. And the way it's set up right now, especially if a sheriff resigned unexpectedly or there was a transition unexpectedly, there could be, in theory, the idea of having to do another full audit within, a couple of months of having just done a biennial audit. So that might be something that we want to address too. So I think let's put a big sticky note on audits. I think there may be a little bit more language that refers back to this in the next section, but
Thank
we
you.
probably have some more work to do on this area.
And one other note I'd just like to make briefly on line 18, there's a reference to department, but should probably a specific reference to the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs.
Yeah, if you want to make that update in subsequent drafts, that'd be great.
The next section, section 3, is actually the particular statute regarding audits made by the auditor of accounts to the sheriff's departments, and is a slight modification from what the Senate had proposed. This will modify or further amend Title 24 VSA, Section 290B, titled Audits. You'll see a highlight on line 19, which adds the words "or participant" to a list. And so Section 9, for context, will read, let me back up a little bit. The uniform system of audits shall include procedures to notify the auditor of accounts in the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs of the establishment of activities of any non-public organization of which the sheriff, an employee of the sheriff, is a director, new language, or participant, and that has a mission or purpose of supplementing the efforts of the sheriff's department. And that's the only difference in that section. The next.
Higley had a question before we move on.
That's kind of a big difference, isn't it?
It is. So this suggestion, the department touched on yesterday in testimony, was from them. And to zoom out to the context, we heard way back, and I think the Senate took more testimony on this, that some of the sheriff's organizations have a nonprofit or a booster, as it's commonly called, attached. And so this would just expand to say that if there's a sheriff or an employee of the sheriff's department and they're running that nonprofit or participating in that nonprofit and its mission is supplementing the efforts of the sheriff's department, that the auditor's scope, that there would be procedures for the audit to say, where is that money coming from and how's it being used? Because if you're sort of taking the public office of sheriff and you also have this other entity that's collecting revenue that's going in, that it should, those audits should sort of capture that activity.
So the department itself came up with that.
The Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs just suggested we add the word or to that language. Because the other language here that's new came from the Senate pass. So the word participant was a suggestion from the Department of State's attorneys.
And just as a live situation with this, the Addison County Sheriff's Department had a 501c3 that they started as sort of a secondary way of revenue donation money for the department. That was kind of, it created this sort of like bifurcation for like oversight of the money inflow. So this just also offered clarity that it was like not just about directors, but the participants within these. So if they weren't a named director, but they were a participant, you know, it was just, this is really closing loopholes to a interesting practice.
Thanks.
Yeah.
The next part of the bill, which varies from, the amendment, which will vary from the Senate proposal, is on page 4. And this adds a new reader assistant heading, conflict of interest. That actually wasn't in there before. But this will modify parts of section 4, which will add a new section to Title 24, to the 315, titled Conflict of Interest. A conflict of interest. We'll see that there's, let's see, three new sections that are highlighted. Just want to quickly mention that D is actually not new language. We just updated the, it was E before, but this one, notice that highlight will be removed in future versions. The new language will more so bootstrap existing state code of ethics. The state code of ethics, rather than really creating a fully parallel conflict of interest code, more or less. Reading the language, new subsection A will read, the state code of ethics and associated definitions set forth under Title III VSA sections 1201 through 1205 shall be applicable to sheriffs and deputy sheriffs. A conflict of interest may exist when a sheriff's or deputy sheriff's immediate family, or the sheriff's or deputy sheriff's business associate, or an organization of which the sheriff or deputy sheriff is affiliated, interferes with the proper discharge of a lawful duty. Subsection B has not been altered from the Senate.
Again, I don't know if you want the time to do this now. I don't understand that piece at all, as far as what does it mean that these affiliates interfere with the proper discharge? Give me an example of how that could happen. I don't understand. I don't understand that little section.
Sure. The state code of ethics is largely couched, the types of conflicts it describes are pecuniary or financial for the most part. And so hypothetically, I suppose a sheriff or deputy sheriff could be affiliated with an organization which has some sort of financial stake in the outcomes of a duty that the law, that the sheriff could be employing at the time. Maybe in contracting, classic example, nepotism, contract is RFP, request for proposals, receive a proposal from a friend, family member, something like that might be marked as inappropriate and would provide suboptimal results based on choosing something for a financial interest or familial, perhaps there.
I think
That's one example.
the request we heard from the sheriffs who testified, and was supported by the department was this question around the conflict of interest language that was in S-17 was entirely novel. Like, it was just a new conflict of interest policy specifically for sheriffs. They were saying we could accomplish the same thing and have it would be comparable to the other elected officials that are covered by the state code of ethics if we just did something like this. I think before we moved anything like this, I'd want to hear from Director Sivrit and other folks about how does this actually work in practice. It's a really good question that you're asking, Representative Higley, because I think we haven't done in this year much work around ethics, and there are lots of conversations coming up because of stuff that's happening in the press about what is the Ethics Commission's role and what do they do and sort of how much power do they have. One of the questions that I kept asking was, if we go to the state code of ethics and there's really a serious complaint about ethics, could that also be a complaint of the Criminal Justice Council? So I think having Director Sivrit and either Chair Sorrell or Director Simons in here too to talk about how all these things relate would be important before we take any action.
Subsection B has not been altered. Subsection C does have new language and reads, the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs shall establish procedures for forwarding ethics complaints from any source to the State Ethics Commission based on the procedures set forth in Title 3 VSA Section 1223. And then D, again, this is actually not new language, it was erroneously highlighted, but was just kind of moved up. Pause there. The next part of the bill, let's see, pertains to Sheriff's Department's compensations and benefits. This was a reading assistant thing that was updated. It was, I think it's called contracts before, for the purposes of being more factually or descriptively accurate, as it was called sheriff's contracts. The Section 5 amends Title 24 VSA.
Sorry, I don't want to jump the gun, but what you're just going to start to say is a town, city, village, or county. And I wonder if this section refers to contracts with anyone else other than a municipality. Like, wouldn't a sheriff have a contract with, for instance, a school or a hospital?
It's a great question. And this whole section does refer to all contracts. The amendments to subsection B, let's see, B in its subdivision 4, inserting city, village, and county. That was just the intent to update some dated terminology.
Okay, so
but does not restrict contracts to just those.
There's more to this 291A contracts that we're not seeing. That's my frustration with reading bills that are condensed like this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, the Port Legislative Council always has to make a decision about how much existing underlying law do they want to write up. So, thank you, Tim.
So you'll see new highlighted text on page 6 in subsection C. Essentially, the changes here will restore or really preserve current statutory language. So you'll see it's not highlighted. That's on the books right now. And we'll add constraints for the use of that 5% figure and funds from those and how they will be expended, really tying them to following a model policy to be created and maintained by the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs.
So, Tim, I just, before you go through I just want to make sure I'm orienting the committee to what happened here because it can be a little confusing. So, after the extensive testimony we've heard about the 5%, and the concern that the language that the Senate as passed used created this new idea that the 5% was an administrative overhead fee, that it was like a separate fee and wanted it put in a separate account from other funds that were received by the sheriff. And there were questions about the way that fee language would be interpreted by the auditors, frankly, and how the maintenance of those separate accounts could be challenging. And I asked witnesses and we repeatedly kind of kept coming back to this thing of what problem are we trying to solve? And I think the real concern was, as we heard from, the conversation about the $400,000 bonuses and the sort of discrepancies in what sheriffs are being paid, that there isn't a consistent policy about how sheriffs are compensated and benefits are paid for. And so I asked legislative council to restore the 5% language in underlying law. So that's what most of this section C does, right? So you'll see that there's no highlights or there's no underlining of most of that highlighted, but then add on this new sentence, which is a reference to a model policy, which you're going to see in the upcoming section. So just wanted to orient the committee to what I asked legislative council to do. So what we're doing is restoring the policy that exists today with the 5%. So sheriffs still have that flexibility to include overhead in their contracts, but then putting some limits on how these kinds of funds can be used in regard to benefits and compensation. So I'll turn it back over to you, Tim. Thanks for sidebar.
Of course. And I'll just pick it up from line 16 with the to be new statutory language. Funds derived from changes for the contract administration of a contract shall only be used for sheriff deputy, or other departmental employee compensation, bonuses, salary supplements, retirement contributions, or employee benefits in accordance with a model policy created and maintained by the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. And the
Thank you. Quick question. What that means is that the administrative charges for the contract can only be used for personnel and their benefits, but the contract payments can be used for equipment, vehicles, maintenance of the facility, those types of things.
So as written, a contract between a party and a sheriff's department can have a certain allowance built into it to cover the administrative costs or costs associated with administration of that contract. The remaining, intake of funds received from the contract, I don't believe there's anything in statute, in here anyways, that really limits how those funds, once received, would be expended in turn.
So it's just the administrative costs derived from that contract, a small piece, up to 5%, that can be used only for personnel and their benefits. If the rest of the revenue they're getting from, say, a contract with a school was needed to supplement like employee salaries or whatever, which I'm sure it would be, that's okay for them to use. But that 5% can't be used for the other department costs like equipment and facilities and cruisers and that type of thing.
Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah, and I think the thing I think your question is getting at, Representative Hango, that I wanted to ask clarity for Tim, is that we're not limiting the ability for the sheriff to use, or any sheriff to use, funds derived from that administrative 5% for any of the other things that would reasonably consider administration here. We're just silent on that. But what we're saying is if you're going to use funds that are derived from this overhead for benefits and compensation, it just needs to be in accordance with the model policy. So if you're using it for this, you have to follow the model policy. So I think that we're silent here unless I'm misunderstanding the construction on the ability to use that administrative fee for, buying a vehicle or, some other expense that could be.
I do not think that's.
I think I'll point out, I think if that is the intent, I think this may need to be redrafted to better reflect that.
Okay.
As written, and this is something perhaps was an error on our part, was so funds derived from charges for the contract administration, that 5% fee really, of a contract shall only be used, and this shall only. I think it was a may before. And so we changed that internally.
Yeah, so it's about what the shell modifies,
Yeah.
right? I was trying to have it modify, to connect if you're using it for these things, then you have to follow the model policy. And I think if the only is modifying, it's unclear. We just need to clarify that somehow. So
We can certainly do that.
probably my fault in suggesting language that wasn't clear in the first place. Representative Hango.
Thank you. So if the intent isn't just for personnel and their benefits, then I would say get rid of that whole section and just say, in accordance with the model policy created, shall be used only in accordance with the model policy created and maintained by.
Yeah. So we're going to get into what model policy we're referring to here in a future section coming up. So let's just say that noted that this isn't as clear as I had hoped it would be, and that's why we do this.
Exactly why we're here.
We'll come back. We'll try to clear this up and not try to wordsmith it online, but duly noted that is didn't quite nail it on the first first pass.
And I think it can be easily adjusted to address that concern.
Thanks, Tim.
Come back to that. New section will be added to this bill, particular section 5A on page 7. And this actually replaces the prior 5A put in by the Senate, which replaces the use of administrative overhead funds in in the years 2023 and 2024. And that had been added by Senate Appropriations. It will replace it with Sheriff's Department's compensation and benefits model policy. I'll pause for a second.
Representative.
So I had that flagged earlier, 5A line 11, after receiving approval from the Vermont Criminal Justice Council. If they are already providing input, which they are on line 9, why do they need to be the overarching approval body when back in the section we just discussed, lines 19 and 20 and 21 says in accordance with the model policy created and maintained by the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs. That to me is a little bit of just, I don't know if it's overkill or it's one body giving approval over what they've already created, which just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I had flagged that before we had the previous discussion.
Yeah, so we'll probably have some policy debate about this when we really dig into committee discussion. I feel pretty strongly that I want the Criminal Justice Council, which has the broader view on what's appropriate for law enforcement model policies and various levels of expertise and input from people who aren't so closely associated and focused with the particular departments that the policy covers, to bring in ideas about, international best practices on the management of law enforcement. I want them to approve the policy. But that's something that this committee can have a debate about. Representative Boyden.
Thank you. I think what you just said makes a lot of sense, but I also agree with Representative Hango that possibly flagging section 5 and C of those, the bottom lines of 18 through 20, that maybe it should be created and maintained by the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, to go off of the point that you just said, because they really emphasize best practices.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was really worried about and that I try to address throughout this, and I think we'll need to clean up that language in that C section on that point to Representative Boyden. We have a body that does model policy creation, that says what the standards and practices are, that certifies law enforcement, that here's complaints, and that's Criminal Justice Council. But then we also have the sort of administration and support, and so there's this thing. I think it's really good to not muddy the waters. And if I've done that here inadvertently, then I think that's part of our work over the next few days is to clean that up. But I want to make sure that, model policy input and creation and approval happens with the Criminal Justice Council, but that the administrative support here we're vesting in the department. And where those things sort of touch, we'll have to clear up the language. Thanks, Tim.
The language of 5A, again titled Sheriff's Department's Compensation and Benefits Model Policy. Subsection A reads, on or before January 1st, 2024, Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, after receiving input from the sheriffs, the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, the Auditor of Accounts, and the Department of Human Resources, and after receiving approval from the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, shall issue a Sheriff's Department Compensation Benefits Model Policy. Subsection B, the Sheriff's Department's Compensation and Benefits Model Policy shall address the structure and use of funds for compensation, bonuses, salary supplements, retirement contributions, and employment benefits for sheriffs, sheriff's deputies, and other departmental employees. Pause there. The next section is a new section to be added, 5B. And in essence, this will create a new position of Deputy Director of Sheriffs, which will provide financial support to sheriffs. It will amend Title 24 VSA Section 367, which is titled Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, adding a new subsection E. And subdivision 1 reads, the Executive Director of the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, in consultation with the Sheriff's Executive Committee, shall appoint a Deputy Director of Sheriffs who shall serve at the pleasure of the Executive Director. Subdivision 2, the Deputy Director of Sheriffs shall administer Sheriff's Department's benefits and payroll, provides centralized support services for the sheriffs with respect to budgetary planning, training, and office management, and perform such other duties as directed by the Executive Director. Subdivision 3, the Deputy Director of Sheriff shall create and maintain policies addressing the structure and use of funds for compensation, bonuses, salary supplements, and retirement contributions, and employee benefits for sheriffs, sheriff's deputies, and other departmental employees. Sheriff's deputies, and other departmental employees shall comply with these policies. Willful failure to comply with these policies shall constitute gross professional misconduct and be category B conduct pursuant to 20 VSA, section 2401, subsection 2.
Representative Engel, sir.
Thank you. So again, this section, subsection 3, the Deputy Director of Sheriff shall create and maintain policies, is in contradiction to what your intent is in section 5, that the CJC is going to create these policies. So I don't want to get into the weeds of that. If we're going to have a further conversation, I would like to flag that I'd like to hear from the Department of the State's Attorneys and Sheriffs about this new position and why it would be necessary when they have a structure that governs sheriffs and state's attorneys already, because I don't know enough about their office to really comment on whether this is a necessary position or not. And I know we're going to go into that further, so I'll let Tim go on with that.
I'll say at a high level, the state's attorney, the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, as we heard from Andy Noonan, from John Campbell repeatedly, really just right now, all they do is pay the sheriff's salaries and maintain the state employees who are the transport deputies. There is no administrative structure. There's no professional support. They do not train sheriffs. They do not tell the sheriffs how to run their offices. And I think that the piece about who creates and maintains policies and cleaning up that language would be really important. And I take that as a really valid cleanup that we need to do in this language. But the general idea here is that we would establish a person who, like the state's attorneys, have some support, would now provide some consistent support. And, you know, what we heard from the Sheriff's Association was like, hey, we know we have some people that come into this office and they don't really have the financial knowledge to do some of the things we might want them to do. We know that there's inconsistency in the way some of these offices are doing things like reporting ticket data because there's, you know, limited computer skills. Wanted to have a person in a position where they could look at the policies around these issues across the sheriff's departments and provide some consistent professional support, and also be in a position to potentially prevent some of the conduct that we've seen, right? Because they can be out there saying, hey, Sheriff, why it seems to be that, you know, the auditor made this recommendation from your predecessor. Why don't we clean up some of those practices and make sure you're doing it consistently with what everybody else does? All of the work that they do in those areas, from what we've heard, is kind of informal through the Sheriff's Association. And so this would be a person who would support the sheriffs in a way that there really isn't any kind of structure right now.
That's understandable. Thank you. I just want to hear from them
Okay.
what their current situation is and how this adding another person would affect their operation.
We will.
If you'd like, I can speak to Representative Hingo's first concern about the conflicting authorities there. This sections 5A and 5B presume that the new deputy director wouldn't be hired immediately. And so it would provide that an interim body, this state's DSASP, and after receiving input from those other entities, to create something by January 1st. And then perhaps afterwards, the deputy would be installed, and then they could create or modify policies going forward after that point.
That still doesn't address where the CJC comes in terms of maintaining.
Sure, not that yet.
Creating and maintaining those policies, but thank you, Tim.
Yeah, I think we can clear this up. I mean, it's because there's the initial piece of there isn't going to be a director for this period of time. We do want a model policy to be developed. And then once it's in place, we want that director to help sort of make sure people are adhering to it. But I don't know if we necessarily need that deputy director to be creating new policy. So I think your point's well taken, Representative Hingo.
Well, I actually would prefer that they did the policy creation and maintenance, but you've already made it very clear that you want the CJC to be in that role. So I'm just trying to build this bill in a way that's consistent so everybody knows what's happening.
Yeah, and I'm very cognizant that this isn't a perfect first draft, but I'm trying to get something on the table that I think is much closer from what I'm hearing from all of the sheriffs in the department to what they could support, because they were really not in support of F-17 as it came over from the Senate. So I think we have some more work to do on this for sure, and I'm not wedded to this exact construct, so we should definitely keep talking.
Okay.
The next section is a new section 5C. This is at the bottom of page 8. And this is session law, which will have the effect of really creating a position. It's titled Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, semicolon position, subsection A. The following position is created in the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. One full-time exempt deputy director of sheriffs. Subsection B. The deputy director of sheriffs shall be funded by a charge assessed on each sheriff's department.
Representative.
So, do we have any idea how that assessment will be prorated or for each department?
It is not yet defined here.
I would say this is a work in progress, and the general gist of what I'm going for here is that I think that generally the sheriffs would prefer to have the position in professional support than lose all the flexibility around how they use their overhead funds. And so part of the sort of balance that I'm creating here is having this extra layer of support and potentially accountability. be paid for by them. So there's a little bit of a balancing act that needs to happen there, and we'll have to flush that out. This is definitely not enough to completely seal that problem. Representative Henga?
Thank you. So the point I'd like to make on this, on letter B, that they're funded by, that this position is funded by a charge assessed on each sheriff's department. I think I heard from several of the sheriffs that we heard from that their departments have very little money. I don't know where they're going to come up with this money to pay this deputy director. And we, the legislature, are creating this position. So I'm not sure why they have to pay for it and why it cannot be part of the state budget.
So without maligning any particular sheriff's office or how they run their office and recognizing all of the challenges we've heard here, my preference, rather than doing this reform bill, would be to completely change the way sheriff's offices work. And I don't think we're prepared to do that. I don't think they're prepared to do that. And I think that would be enormously disruptive. I think that the majority of the folks in this building who've been trying to address some of the issues here. Okay.
We're holding it.
Yeah.
Nobody's allowed to walk out of it.
Yeah. The majority of folks in this building who have been trying to find a way through these recent incidents and address some of the public concern around accountability and transparency with sheriff's offices, they would like to just cut off any money that those sheriffs have. And I agree that that's probably not the best way forward. And so as a attempt to satisfy the concern about some of that accountability, I want to create this position. I also think there's a nexus between the fact that sheriffs are, they're kind of an entrepreneurial, independent entity. They're public, but they also have a lot of independence where we tell them, go out, get contracts, run your business. Some of them do that really well and have big cash on hand, and some of them don't. And I believe that the association will come back to us with a proposal about how to do this in a way that doesn't sort of punish the smaller agencies that are strapped. But I feel pretty strongly that this is moving in the direction of the sheriff's position on this and wanting to invest in professionalism as opposed to sort of getting their flexibility around administrative overhead getting squeezed to the point where they don't have the ability to sort of fund themselves in a sustainable way. So it's a balancing act, and I don't think we've quite nailed it, but I think that the sheriffs will come to us over the next few days with some recommendations about how to flesh this out and say, how would we pay for this position? I think that they'll be supportive of the construct, but there are some details that just aren't in this initial draft.
Understood, and I appreciate that you understand the small departments that may not be able to. I mean, we're essentially giving them back the 5% that the Senate wanted to take away from them. And now we're telling them, well, you have to take some of that 5% and you've got to pay for this new position that we're creating. That's the big picture that I'm seeing. So hopefully we can come to some kind of compromise with them.
Yeah, so just to put it in a sense of scale though, if you have 14 sheriffs covering one new position that, let's say it's the whole thing with salary, benefits and office costs $150,000 a year, we're talking about a little more than $10,000 if that fee was assessed evenly across all the departments. So we're not talking about a huge investment in this one.
I would hope it would be sort of a prorated charge for each department as well, because certainly little county should not be paying as much as big county.
Representative Chase.
Prorated based on the number of deputies or the district size?
I would probably go by contracts. So, and this is right off the top of my head, like maybe if a department only brings in $200,000 worth of contracts, they pay a percentage, whereas a department that brings in $1 million worth of contracts pays a bigger percentage of their contracts towards this position. I don't even know. That was a brand new thought to me.
I think we may hear some suggestions that from the sheriffs and the department themselves over the next couple of days. Then
Which is
next
great.
week we can further have this conversation and figure out which direction we want to go. At this point, I was like, here's an idea of this position. The sheriffs will fund it somehow, recognizing that I hadn't spelled all the details out in this first draft, but I anticipate some suggestions coming our way soon.
The next new section is section 5D, and this is page 9 at the top. This will add to the list of individuals being transported by transport deputies. Specifically juveniles being transported to court or to a court-ordered facility. You can see the new language on line 4. And I've just highlighted the entire statutory section, just as it appears its entirety, it's new from the Senate version, but you can see just that new language is on the added part.
And I don't know a whole lot about this language. We're going to have to hear the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs requested this for clarity, so we'll have them testify to it. But Representative Hinkle.
Thank you. Is there anything, and this may be out of your wheelhouse, Tim, that says that when a juvenile is being transported or held somewhere, that they need to have more than one adult present? The reason I ask that is I understand that in some sheriff's offices, there are juveniles being held overnight or over the weekend, for lack of a better place to put them. And there have to be 2 correctional officers of some kind, or law enforcement officers rather, with them. And I don't know if this applies to the transport part, but I think maybe we should hear from DCF or somebody on that as well, Mr. Chair, because I think there are different regulations around working with juveniles than working with adults.
It's fair. I'll try and work with some of our colleagues to figure out who the appropriate folks are to testify on that.
And I have one additional question about this section.
Sure.
We heard from the judiciary, I think, maybe not, maybe somebody else, that we need more deputies to do transport if they're going to be mandated to do transport. And where are these deputies going to come from? I mean, some departments are really, I think ours in St. Albans are really down on employees right now. So where are we going to get them, and who's going to pay for the extra mandated jobs that they're going to be doing?
I heard less concern about the sort of specifying the duties of what the transport sheriffs do. And there's obviously the labor concern across all law enforcement right now. But that the really big challenge that was in S17 that's coming up, that's related to this, but it's not exactly addressed in this section, is the mandate about coverage of courthouses. That actually was the biggest point, I think, of friction, and there's a real desire. So not knowing exactly how to resolve that without doing more. There's a report in here that I've asked for, because right now recall that there's the use of private security, there's per diem courthouse security that are payments to sheriffs, and then there are some deputies that are permanently assigned to the courthouses from some sheriff's departments. And so there's inconsistency, and some of the courthouses don't have coverage, and it holds things up. And so we heard from the judiciary administrative staff and Judge Zone that they'd like us to invest more. The budget recommendation had more money, and it was about the rates. And then what's been brought in testimony to us was this idea of adding positions, and I didn't feel comfortable at least in this first draft, saying, oh, yes, I know exactly how many positions would cover the gaps. And I have questions that I would love to ask of both some of our colleagues and, Terry Persones and about, what would it look like to phase in and add on to the sort of state employed people the way we heard requests from Representative Oliver. So it's just such a big question and it pulls the budget in such a way that I didn't want to. So I kind of put a placeholder report in here. We might have to figure that out next year. Maybe there's a way in the next couple of weeks for us to sort of start moving in that direction. But there is money in the budget to increase the financial support for courthouse security. At least that was in the request that came over from House Judiciary, is my understanding.
Okay, so I did hear 25, the number 25 thrown out there, that new positions are needed for these particular functions. Are we mandating that now deputy sheriffs whose primary responsibility is transportation of prisoners, persons with a mental condition or psychiatric disability will now need to also, mandating that they will now need to be the ones to transport these juveniles? That's what the addition of this language is. Is that correct?
I don't know if it would mandate it so much as just clarify that if they are transporting it, those individuals, the juveniles that is, they shall be paid by the state of Vermont. And perhaps I misstated that earlier, but it's really about clarifying who will be paying those transport.
Okay, great. And just as an aside on the workforce shortage, I also heard that correctional institutions are now saying that sheriff's deputies are required to transport individuals from correctional facilities to certain hearings and other places, which I don't think should be happening according to what is in statute, but I don't know that. But I just want to put that out there, that our sheriffs are being pulled in so many directions and there are so few of them that I'm just really concerned that all of this work that we're asking them to do is not going to get done. And it's all necessary work, right? I mean, somebody's got to do it. And it seems like the legislature feels like, oh, it's just really easy, just tell the sheriffs they got to do it. And that's,
I would say that this draft takes a big step back from the demands that were put on sheriffs that were in S-17,
and that's great.
Yeah, so we're trying to head in that direction.
That's fine. This is the day for me to lay it out all out on the table.
I love it. I think we're making a lot of progress here. Great. All right, so anything more on the section 5B? All right, so let's plow ahead.
The next part of the bill pertains to sheriff's duties. This is section 6. The new duties, which were introduced by the Senate, 2 of the 3 are reserved as the Senate had them, those being the sheriffs being required to maintain a work schedule and the requirement that sheriff's deputies, sheriff's departments provide that they comply with the provisions of standard operating procedures and manuals and policies created by, maintained by DSAS. It does modify the new duty relating to the provision of escort services for survivors of domestic violence, essentially removing the affirmative duty for sheriffs to provide that service, but maintaining the prohibition on seeking fees for that service. Fees from victims, that is. And it will now read, starting in line 11, subsection D, the sheriff's department shall not seek a fee from an individual who has a relief from abuse order pursuant to Title 15 VSA, Section 1103, or any representative of that individual for providing assistance in the retrieval of the individual's personal belongings from the individual's residence. Sorry.
And before I go to Representative Hango, just wanted to highlight something that Tim just said, so everybody's kind of got it top of mind before we talk about this section. So in S17, it said sheriffs will be the ones who do this work when there's an RFA, period. And the feedback we heard in testimony, and I got in several emails, I don't know if you all got it, was that there are lots of law enforcement agencies that do this work already, and some charge and some don't. And so I think there was broad agreement that it's probably not good practice to have the sort of victim of, or survivor, I should say, of domestic violence have to pay a direct fee to law enforcement in order to accommodate this. But that the mandate that the sheriff be the only one doing it that was implied, or maybe it was explicit actually in S17 as it passed the Senate. So it took away that mandate, acknowledging that in some places the local police department or some other law enforcement agency might be doing that work, and basically just said, you know, the department shouldn't charge a fee when they have to do that. And at least remove that mandate. Representative Hank.
Thank you. My question is, with what remains from S17 on line 5 on page 10, that the sheriff shall maintain a record of the sheriff's work schedule, including et cetera, et cetera. So I'm disappointed that that's still in there, because the nature of a sheriff's work tends to be confidential in some respects, in that they may be doing investigations, they may be trying to solve a case. I don't even know how to put it, but why and who, well, never mind the why, because it's in there, but who will be able to view, I think we heard this as a question from a witness, who will be able to view this sheriff's work schedule? Will it be public? And how will that affect the sheriff's ability to get their work done?
I don't know if that's a question that anybody who's here at the table can answer, but Tim did.
I certainly
talk
can.
About the public records.
Exactly. The Public Records Act would be in play here. This work schedule would be subject to request by anybody who asks.
And I don't like that because of the sometimes confidential nature of the work that a law enforcement officer has to do. Even if the sheriff themselves are not the ones going out on patrol or going out to investigate, they still would be involved in this type of confidential work. And they're an elected official, right? So what other elected officials do we have who have to publish their daily work schedule for the general public to look at? I don't know the answer to that.
Representative Boyd.
I'm wondering how detailed the work schedule needs to be in order to be published. Because like, could they just say, I work Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m.? Or does it need to be, I went to lunch with so-and-so, or I'm doing an investigation for this?
As I read it, Tim, to that point, it's just that they have to say which days they worked, which days they were taking leave, and when they were working remotely outside of their district. Those are the only pieces of information.
And past tense, not future tense. I will be working these days, because that's my concern. I don't want people to, if I were the sheriff, I would not want them, the general public, to know when I was going to be in their town, for instance, doing a patrol.
It's past tense, right, Tim? So they have to keep a record of what they've done, not an agenda of what they're planning on doing, right?
If a sheriff were to create a record of, let's say, just have a calendar and input something in the future, and somebody requested it today, that would be subject to the Public Records Act. And then that notification or that event would be part of the record that would have to be presented, subject to exemptions under the Public Record Act. So there are, there's a very long list of exemptions of information that doesn't necessarily have to be or can be released to the public. And certain elements of personal information, information having to do with the conduct of ongoing investigation and criminal procedures. I know off the top of my head, just to a certain degree are exempted from public release.
So building on that, I have no problem with the sheriff giving their work schedule to the body that hires them, that contracts with them, like for instance, the town select board. If they need to know when the sheriff is expected to be in their town, and then for whatever reason, and this is happening, that the sheriff doesn't show up to do that patrol, they can then immediately get on that and say, hey, we noticed you weren't here, what happened? But for the general public to know, that's my concern. I have no problem with contractual, this is my work schedule, these are the days I actually worked type of thing.
Tim, wouldn't today, absent this, any documentation that a sheriff's office has about, for instance, how many hours do they patrol in each community they have a contract with? All of that's subject to public record request now, isn't it?
Correct.
The general public has access to any data from any elected official unless it's explicitly covered as exempt. For instance, the personal information that Tim mentioned, but stuff about, how many hours patrolled and things like that, those records would all be.
And in the past tense, or in a general statement, I will be in your town for 40 hours the week of April 20th. I'm good with that, but I have heard town officials express concern that if the general public knows that the sheriff will be here between 5 a.m. and 10 a.m. on Friday, the 21st, that becomes an issue with folks who are paying attention to the sheriff's schedule and maybe engaging in activity that they should not be engaging in under the law.
I don't think that this language that's here addresses any specificity about like where the sheriff's working or kind of their patrol strategy, those pieces, which would be subject to a public records request. I don't think they would be advertised, which I think is the point maybe that you're bringing up, Representative Hango. This too would be, it's a requirement that there be a record of when the sheriff worked, took leave, and a remote work. That language came over from the Senate, and I believe, and maybe Tim can correct me if I'm wrong, that they looked for a much greater level of specificity initially because of there were concerns about a couple of sheriffs who people were even questioning whether they were still in state for a good period of time, which is where I think this comes from. But Tim, did they initially have things about hourly and more details?
Originally had the word detail work schedule, and then they removed the word detail.
So one last question, Tim, does this apply to just the sheriff or the sheriff's deputies as well? Because it doesn't really say.
As written, it will apply to only the sheriffs, not any other employees of the, of course, this is a mandate to create records. Doesn't necessarily prevent deputies or other employees of the sheriff's department from creating records in the form of work schedules. That may be a condition of employment in those departments as well.
Thanks.
Any other questions on section 6? All right, we're in the home stretch here.
No modifications have been made to Senate Section 7 in the bill. Section 7A is a new section added to these S17 titled Sheriff's Deputy Provision of Courthouse Security, report. And read through this. On or before December 1st, 2023, the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, in consultation with the judiciary, shall report to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs and the Senate Committee on Government Operations on the required number of sheriff's deputies that need to be made available to provide law enforcement and security services to county and state courthouses to facilitate regular courthouse operations. The department shall also provide recommendations to adjust the number of sheriff's deputies necessary to accomplish facilitating regular courthouse operations and develop a budget request for any necessary additional sheriff's deputies.
So, before we get into discussion of this section, I will just preface this by saying this is basically a placeholder. I don't know what to do about this issue right now. It's so sticky. It's just, we all know we need courthouse security. Who pays for it and who's employed by whom is a really thorny question. If we can make some progress on it in the next few days, fantastic. But I don't know if we can do the mandate that's in 7 without doing something else on the budget side, or at least specifying that increased funding that was requested and that the House Judiciary Committee supported when they were hearing from the Board of Administration as well. I don't know what to do about it right now. So basically, this is just I don't know what to do right now. Representative Morgan.
I'm just going to throw on the table. Yeah, exactly. I concur. Because in dealing with the Grand Isle County situation with their courthouse right now, they're contract folks from the judiciary because they just don't have the manpower to provide courthouse security. They're just now getting more fully staffed, and I think you and I know why. It's a result of something else that has occurred. So, but anyway, but regardless of that, it's not a guarantee at any given place in time that any department in the 14 counties is going to be able or not be able to do so. We just need to be mindful of that as well, like as this. So it's a sticky wicket at best. Yeah, I get it.
And there's I just started to really dig in this a little bit, but there are some memos from the years that members of House Judiciary have shared with me. A lot of stuff from Terry Corsoni's that would, that basically talks about the long history of this. And we heard a little bit from her and others about, there is a budget increase in the hourly compensation in the sort of statewide. So I think in the budget this year, we're taking some steps in the right direction in terms of trying to support the staffing. But I think this fundamental question of should they be more like the transport deputies is something that seems like a good suggestion. I'm not sure that in the context of, a budget that's probably 95% along its way that we're going to be able to do. But I have some questions that I'd like us over the next few days to ask appropriations, the judiciary and the court administrator, and see if there's something better we can do on this issue. But as of today, I'm not sure what it is. Representative Cooper, go ahead.
And this issue is restricted to the 25.
Well, so here's the thing.
Well, no.
About the 25. I want to be careful about that because I think that if I understood that correctly, that would be like if you wanted to say the mandated one deputy for every courthouse, you would need 25 positions. I think to get there, we'd have to start with what is the gap that we're trying to fill today and how many positions would it take for us to fill the gap? And we phase in more of those over time. I don't think there's any scenario where we could realistically in one budget year would add 25 positions and say we have this whole new fleet of deputies. I also think that would disrupt existing contracts that exist that are going well, where one sheriff's department has the staff and they're fully contracted with the courthouses and it works great. It does in a few places, but.
I wonder. I inferred from what somebody said the other day that maybe some of the transport deputies were used for something else when they didn't have any transport stuff to do, which then is completely inappropriate. But one of the other sheriffs said their transport deputies are a block that comes and never goes. And the difference for me, I think, is that if you don't give them benefits and that guarantee, you're looking at a part-time job. Somebody's going to look for another job when they have the opportunity. And if you want a permanent and functional staff, you probably have to go the way of making them employees, not at wills.
Yeah, and the flip side of that, the problem that we're having now is we are paying for private contractors that don't have the same ability that a certified law enforcement officer would have to actually assist the courthouses in maintaining the public safety that they want. So right now we're spending money on private security that, doesn't really do do as much as what we heard, the judiciary would like it to do.
Post-COVID, we have the luxury of allowing courthouses to be closed because of staffing issues. Still a big backlog.
Yeah, so the interest of keeping the courthouses open and safe at the same time. I think we've taken a step in the right direction with adding some more money to the budget and increasing the compensation to try to get those per diem folks who are attached to the courthouses. But I just don't think I think there's a clear answer to this problem right now that we can just drop into this bill. But maybe there's a step we can make in the right direction soon. So definitely going to need to take some more testimony on this section and see what we can do.
Sections 8 and 9 of the bill have not been modified. Sorry, 8 has not been. Actually, no, 9 has not been either. The next new addition we'll see highlighted, and that's on page 12, is a new section titled, reading assistant heading, it reads Sheriff's Department's Reform Report. The new section 10, and this will replace what was the Senate had as the creation of a Sheriff's Department's Oversight Task Force. We'll now have a report required here, which will have DSAS in consultation with some other entities, consider largely the same issues relating to the oversight of the Sheriff's Department. On line 3, section 10 reads, Sheriff's Department Reform, report. On or before November 15th, 2023, the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, in consultation with the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, the Auditor of Accounts, the Vermont Association of County Judges, the Chief Superior Court Judge, and the Vermont Sheriff's Association, shall report to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs and the Senate Committee on Government Operations on the following. 1, recommended policies and best practices to be included in standard operating procedures. Skip down to 5, which is new. Recommended membership and duties of an advisory commission for sheriffs comparable to or combined with the Vermont State Police Advisory Commission as related to both conduct and administration of sheriff's departments. New language in 6 reads the creation of a sustainable funding model for sheriff's departments, including the consolidation or reorganization of sheriff's departments. And let's see, those are what has been modified or added there. And
Representative Nugent has a question.
yes,
On that section about consolidation, I'm reading that as almost as if it's required, and I was wondering if that was the intent or if it's just something that we want to make sure is put on the table as an option.
So I guess I would answer that by zooming back out. The Senate created an oversight task force, brought in a bunch of people who are already in large part working on law enforcement reform issues, specifically the Criminal Justice Council. We heard testimony yesterday that probably a good step would be to have the department just do a report for us. And so I really tried to scale down the what do we really need to spend money on, and have people being asked to do an official set of meetings over, because I think we're going to be working on these issues more here, at length. And in the way that the task force was defined, I think there's actually a lot of that information out there, and there are really policy decisions for us to consider. I took a lot of the things the Senate recommended, and then I added a few things. But I guess, do you have a sense of, and if people think that there should be changes to this, I'm not married to these, but the general gist of this is I'm going from having a whole bunch of people be required to meet in session law and doing a whole big task force to telling the department, go out and talk to the people you already work with and summarize some of these things for us so that when we get back here in January, we actually have some ideas to chew on.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, it would make sense to me, given where we're at, from what I understand, that it would be good to put that on the table as an option, but not necessarily require it.
Yeah, I tried to leave things to say, look at this, but don't, yeah, I try not to go quite as far in terms of where I wanted them to go on any of these issues as maybe the Senate language in a couple of places. Representative Boyd.
This might be a silly question, but are we asking for just one report or an annual?
I only meant this to be one report.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think there's more work that we're gonna have to do. That's pretty clear. And there's some issues we left on the table, so I think we're just not gonna get everything done this year. It's
gonna be an evolving conversation.
And I don't know if it makes sense to ask all the entities that were listed in that task force to have formal meetings over the summer and in fall. I think we're not quite there yet because the questions, I don't think we've even fully determined the questions that we would want to ask them. I personally think that there should be a broader conversation over the next several years about how many sheriffs do we need? Could there be consolidation and reorganization? This touches on that. It may be that we really do want to keep the constitutional historical thing of 14 sheriffs in 14 counties. But I think that that's a question that this body is going to have to wrestle with. And if we, if we want to go to a task force that's going to talk about that and bring everybody informally, I think we need to better define what the questions are that we're asking. And this, report from the folks who are already working in these areas and are the experts that work on this stuff every day is, I think, that going to be a valuable addition to our conversations next year. Great. I think we almost made it.
The only last section is 11 pertaining to effective dates. And the only modification here is that it bumps out the effective date for section 5 to January 1st, 2024. Section 5 is the amended language to the sheriff's contracting provision, that 5% that we've been talking about, and how the what's proposed in this amendment to S17 will require those expenditures of those funds to be in accordance with the model policy. That model policy will be put into place by January 1st, 2024. So giving time for the pieces to fit together, I suppose.
So thank you all. A lot of good feedback and ideas that'll inform another round on this. We'll come back to this probably next week. And so I'll look forward to if folks have other thoughts and ideas that we should ask him about on this, but I think we're now due to hear a couple of drive-throughs on other bills that we've been asked to give that before they get on their way. So Tim, thank you very much for your hard work on this. And we'll have you back in next week, I'm sure.
Thank you.
All right, committee. Ben is here and we're gonna learn a little bit about S14. So Ben, would you like to take the witness chair, please?
Morning. For the record, my name is Ben Novogrodsky from the Office of Legislative Counsel, and I come here bearing fruits, or gifts rather, from the House Judiciary Committee. So before the committee this morning is, I just sent it to Andrea a few minutes ago, draft 2.7 of a strike all amendment to S14, which is an act relating to a report on criminal justice related investments and trends. It has evolved a little bit more beyond than just a report, but to focus this committee's attention on sort of this cross jurisdictional bill. Section 1 is squarely within House Judiciary's jurisdiction. So what this committee should be looking at is section 2 and on, which adds section 126 to title 28, which would be the establishment of the Coordinated Justice Reform Advisory Council. So since it's the creation of a state council, it falls within this committee's jurisdiction about the format, but not necessarily the underlying policies as to why it's being created. So I will attempt to kind of walk through that. There may be some background information that if you have some questions, feel free to ask. But essentially what this council does is to attempt to create a collaborative and unified approach to support state and local community-based programs and services that are consistent with Vermont's restorative justice policy under section 2A of title 28. What that policy is, it's a fairly comprehensive policy, but to summarize, it's essentially the state policy that principles of restorative justice be included in shaping how the criminal justice system responds to persons charged with or convicted of criminal offenses, and how the state responds to persons who are in contempt of child support orders. The goal is a community response to a person's wrongdoing at its earliest onset, and a type and intensity of sanction tailored to each instance of wrongdoing. The policy objectives are to resolve conflicts and disputes by means of a non-adversarial process, so out of court, repair damage caused by the criminal acts to communities in which they occur, and to address the wrongs inflicted on individual victims, and to reduce the risk of an offender committing a more serious crime in the future that would require a more intensive and more costly sanction, such as incarceration. There are other requirements, but that's kind of the gist of the policy. So this council is grounded in those restorative justice policies to include that unified approach. This also builds on that restorative justice policy. It supplements it to charge the committee to include, to consult with state and local partners to use a data-driven approach to improve public safety, reduce correctional and criminal justice spending, and reinvest those savings and redirect other funds in strategies that foster desistance or decrease crime delinquencies and recidivism.
Yes, Representative.
Thank you. Is this, what you just gave us as a brief overview, is it written somewhere in statute that I can read, like
The restorative justice
Yeah.
policy? Yes, it's Title 28, Section 2A.
Okay, and is that justice reinvestment?
No, that's the restorative justice policy. Justice reinvestment is not in statute. Justice reinvestment, and I guess I'll give as brief as I can overview of this. So justice reinvestment is really a 15 to 20 year initiative that has been ongoing in the state of Vermont, but is really a nationwide initiative. 36 states have taken this on across the country, and it is a data-driven approach to improve public safety, reduce corrections and related criminal justice spending, and reinvest the strategies that can reduce crime and decrease recidivism. There have been 2 iterations of that in the state. There's been Justice Reinvestment 1, which started back in 2008, and Justice Reinvestment 2 that started, I believe, in 2017 or 2018. There have been many reforms resulting from those programs, which I can go into, but it can get quite intensive and substantive and policy related, which is really within the purview of the judiciary committees.
So I cannot process that much information in that quick, like I'm still on the second sentence that you said.
I just want to take a big step back here and say, I think all we're being asked to really look at is does the bill adhere toward our policy around sunsets and how we set up council?
Exactly.
The policy behind it is absolutely not in our jurisdiction at all.
Okay, and I apologize if I missed that while I was chasing Tim out.
No worries.
Thank you.
No worries.
It's totally beyond.
All we're being asked to do is say, does this fit into our general world when we're looking at commissions, boards?
Right.
So here's my question.
Is the as-passed version the version that has the council in it? Because I don't
No.
want to see, okay, great, because the as-passed is what was put on our.
Okay, no, it is many iterations after that. It's
Okay. What should we,
draft 2.7.
okay, and where could we find that?
I have that, okay, there we go. All right, I have the as passed from, I got a 2.7. 2.7.
There you go, look at that.
Sweet.
Andrea works on that. Yeah.
I was really fresh. Thank you.
And there are some highlighted things in this, but that's really something that House Judiciary will understand. It's not so relevant. It's just changes from the last version. So I'm sorry, this is,
Highlights.
yeah.
All we're looking at
Is just the overall structure of this and
section 2.
yes, and beyond, yes. So I apologize for sort of stepping in it by kind of explaining what the purpose of the council is, but the structure of it is beyond that purpose. It has 8 members, including the Attorney General or designee, the Chief Superior Judge or designee, the Commissioner of Corrections or designee, the Commissioner for Children or Families or designee, the Executive Director of the Vermont Center for Crime Victim Services or designee, the Executive Director of the Vermont Statistical Analysis Center, which is also known as the Crime Research Group, one current member of the House, selected from either the Committee on Appropriations, on Corrections or Institutions, or the Judiciary appointed by the Speaker, and one member of the Senate selected from either Appropriations or Judiciary, appointed by the Committee on Committees. So that's the membership composition. The section C goes into the powers and duties of the council. It makes recommendations. It has the ability to review and provide recommendations on the priorities and spendings related to its charge. It can review appropriations, fiscal reauthorizations and allocations from the most recent fiscal year. It has the duty to consult with various stakeholders that are involved in this policy development, DMH, the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, the Defender General, the Parole Board, the Office of Racial Equity, the Office of the Child, Youth, and Family Advocate, the Vermont Network, and community justice centers or other entities that administer restorative justice programs. It has the ability to issue 2 reports. One is to consider and make recommendations on a more sustainable planning structure for these programs, and one to the Commissioner on Corrections by September 1st for the Commissioner to incorporate not more than $900,000 to support these programs in the corrections budget.
That's them this council advising on a budget line item that already exists, not the creation of a new appropriation in this bill.
Correct. So the Justice Reinvestment 2 line item is one that already exists. It's in the current budget. They are just making a recommendation of not more than $900,000 from that to support these initiatives. The commissioner, and you'll see later on, is obligated to include that in the department's proposed budget that the governor will use in the ultimate recommend to the legislature. The council is assisted by the AG's office, DOC, and DCF for technical, administrative, and legal assistance in their respective areas of jurisdiction. Again, you'll see on page 10, these are those reports. The one would be in the form of proposed legislation. That's the more sustainable model. The other, as far as the recommendations to the commissioner, will also go to standing committees of jurisdiction. The council, as far as how it conducts its business, the chief judge shall call the first meeting on or before July 1st of this year. He will be the chair of the council. They'll meet not more than 6 times. They're paid for not more than 6 times. That compensation reimbursement only occurs if they are not employees of the state or not otherwise compensated by their own.
The standard.
Exactly. They have the power to elect other officers, to establish committees, to create rules and procedures. The terms of appointment So essentially the judge, the attorney general, the executive director of the Crime Victim Services and the Statistical Analysis Center designee serve for a term of 3 years. The commissioners and the legislature serve for a term of 2 years with the initial appointments of being only 1 year. And the reason for that is to align their terms with the biennium, which would align with elections for legislators and terms of appointment for the commissioners. So that way there's a little bit consistency. There's some people serving longer in case there's turnover or other unforeseen circumstances where someone needs to be replaced. And people can serve again, they can be reappointed. Quorum is a simple majority, and council meetings are subject to the open meetings law, which this would be anyway, but language is put in there to ensure that that's understood. You'll see in section 3, this is the provision that I referred to about the commissioner incorporating the recommendations into the department's budget. And then section 4 are various repeals. Really the only two that are relevant to this committee is A and C. So this committee sunsets in 5 years, or this advisory council sunsets in 5 years, depending on the recommendations that it may make about a more sustainable model. There was discussion that maybe it would negate the need for this council. Either way, it would be revisited. And then the corresponding provision for the council or the commissioner's recommendations would sunset at the same time since they're connected.
So the first two things I always ask are already checked off here. We've got a repeal in 2028, so we've got a sunset on the council, so no permanent councils. And the compensation language is the sort of typical piece of our per diem. So it sounds like the committee already checked off both of those things that I always look for in the creation of a new body like that. Thank you very much. I see Representative Dolan from our House Judiciary Committee shaking her head. The one question I had, which is probably for Representative Dolan, not Ben, is the consideration of another council or existing board that could do this work, or did the committee really feel like we needed to establish this new advisory council?
Yes, but this was needed. I think there was interest of maybe tying other things into this now that this was created, but there isn't a format where this can already take place.
Any other questions from the committee? I think the House Judiciary Committee did a great job. That's probably because folks like Representative Dolan or Representative Malone have heard me complaining about the committees are created that don't have a sunset.
Sunset committee on sunsets.
So, or committee on, do we want to, on this sort of drive through, are we, can the folks who are here kind of give me a thumbs up if they don't have any big concerns, or go ahead, Representative?
Thanks. I just have a question for Representative Dolan. In your committee, was there any discussion about the sunset or the funding and any recommendations other than what is printed in the bill?
We did talk about the sunset. We just agreed like that. I think for us, there was just this kind of excitement of the possibility of this. And so we were kind of like going ahead of like, what about this, what about this? And we really saw this as a small step, let's get it started, and that there's the potential for a lot of great work to come. We just didn't want to like spell it out with, it has to be by this year or this year. So we think 5 years gives enough time to figure it out. It couldn't be in a year from now, though, we really know where it's gonna go.
Okay, and the funding, your committee was
The 900
with that, yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be great if it was more, but again, it was a starting point that so this took a lot of collaboration among all the stakeholders. So we got to this piece and maybe it'll grow from there.
Thank you.
It looks to me, and this is more of an appropriations question, but I think the funding for the council itself, they're gonna have a say in that 900,000 that's already in the appropriation line, but the council itself is mostly people who are there who hold office. So I bet it has a pretty de minimis, like the 6 meetings, the per diems for those are not going to be the council itself that isn't going to cost the state, more than hundreds of dollars a year. All right. Committee, are we okay with this council? We've got just enough folks to constitute a recommendation here. Yeah. All right. So I think we can say the drive-by was successful. Thank you, Representative Dolan. Ben, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I believe Mr. Hall is going to be doing a quick pass through on S48 for us. Yes, please.
Okay.
Whiplash day.
That's not a year. That's not a year.
I just looked at the topic and I was like, wait, what?
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm David Hall, one of your legislative counsel. I generally staff commerce, economic development, housing, freedom protection, businesses, that type of stuff. I'm here on S48, an act relating to regulating the sale of catalytic converters. Not sure the scope of your interest in this, but happy to do whatever you want, whether it's a quick overview or specific questions or particular sections, let me know.
I think that we were asked to take a look at this because there's a recommendation for law enforcement, probably getting into like section 4 perhaps.
Okay.
That has to do with our administration of public safety jurisdiction. So
fair enough. Okay, well, so in a nutshell, this puts some limitations on the sale and transportation of catalytic converters, including limitations on who can buy and sell, how many in a day they can whether they can transport them, and if they do, they have to mark them permanently. Basically, we already regulate catalytic converters as scrap metal. There's a chapter in Title IX for scrap metal processors, and that is largely the community of salvage dealers, which are regulated in turn by ANR, by AOT, by the towns. So there's a lot of regulation going on here, and this expands that a little bit. Section 4, the adoption of forms of public outreach, is a pair of charges. The first one is for DPS to sort of adopt these sample forms that the public, that processors, that buyers and sellers could use, because there are requirements in law that, they require you to establish ownership, basically a chain of custody of these products. So sample forms, thought is it'd be handy for people to be able to download, the information in a sample form that they could use for record keeping purposes. So section B, this charge to DPS and to ANR is really a public outreach campaign. So this is for both sellers of scrap metal that are subject to that title and, that chapter in Title IX, and for law enforcement, just concerning the requirements for buying, selling, transporting, and record keeping. And then the other piece is related to that, and that's section 5. It is a charge directly to the Criminal Justice Council. And this is over in Title 20. This is their powers and duties. You'll see on page 7 of 8 of this draft 2.1, there's a new subdivision 3 that says, this is based on testimony from the council, and it says at the conclusion of each year of the General Assembly, basically prepare materials for law enforcement, including constables exercising law enforcement authority, materials or training concerning new or amended state law that affects law enforcement activities, including changes to civil, criminal, administrative penalties, enforcement actions. One of the questions that came up in commerce was, are people aware of this law? Are they following this law? Does law enforcement know they have the tools to be able to inspect the records of these scrap metal processors? Do salvage yard dealers know they're subject to Title IX, Chapter 82, and they should be keeping records of sales? So the sections 4 and 5 really are to sort of elevate the awareness in both the public and in this community on what their duties and responsibilities are.
So DPS and ANR had the public outreach piece, and then the council is empowered here, not just on this, but it looks like this is pretty broad. It says every 2 years after the General Assembly, the council has to say update law enforcement about what we did here.
That's correct. And there was, some testimony, they're kind of already doing this, but the purpose here is to make sure it's widespread and makes it to all the constituent elements of law enforcement that are out and around the state.
But they testified to Commerce that they were comfortable with this language.
I would defer to Representative White on whether they testified further on this particular language, because I was not present for that.
Okay. But did this language come from the council, or was this language from from the House Commerce.
I think it's fair to say that in the council's testimony, they suggested basically this concept, and then this language was prepared to reflect the testimony.
Representative White.
I would agree with everything David just said, that we had consulted with the council, they were okay with this process. And that both these sections were exactly about just making sure that all people were well informed of what the requirements were, comply with those, and that there was a regular update, because there had been some expressed concern about that, that information not always disseminated in all places.
I'm always cautious about giving them more work, given that we give them a lot of work in here, but this sounds sort of like what they're already doing anyway to a large extent, from what we know. So I feel pretty comfortable with this language if they didn't raise any big concerns in your committee. Anybody have any other questions on this?
No questions. It was just this morning, Representative Branning came in, and that was the only portion that she highlighted for us to take a look at, was that one.
I want you to speak to you.
Yeah, just this piece right here, three subsections.
I'm willing to sort of give this the unofficial thumbs up. Anybody have any concerns before we?
No concerns.
All right, so thumbs. House Step Labs approved. Thanks very much, David and Representative White.
My pleasure.
All right, well.
Good to see you down here, sir.
Hard work this morning, committee. Thanks for being the last one standing here.
I know, where did everybody go?
It's gonna be a.
It's gonna be,
down floor.
yeah, it's gonna be a.
We'll see you up on the floor.